Every human would have experienced trauma in their life in one form or the other, like adverse childhood experience, neglect, sexual abuse, violence, bullying, attachment trauma, or loss of loved ones. How we process trauma varies and influenced by our beliefs and culture we are nurtured. Hey folks, welcome to Long Mind Channel. For those watching me for the first time, I'm Devi Sundar, respiratory physiotherapist, counselor, psychotherapist, and health coach. I'm passionate to transform lives of people with chronic lung and mental health disorder using a holistic approach. Today, I'm going to talk about psychological trauma and its impact on breathing. Why this topic today? Because our whole world is impacted by trauma caused by COVID-19, with this variant still persisting and a number of lives missed on this planet. As a respiratory physiotherapist and psychotherapist, I work with people experiencing both global symptoms of COVID and also the trauma from the losses of their loved ones, job, and their physical space, their homes. I have split this video into two parts. In this part one, I'm going to talk about what is trauma, which organ in our body stores and processes trauma? What are the big and small traumas, the big T's and the small T's? How our body reacts to trauma stresses? How our lung reacts to trauma stresses? In part two, that is my next video, I'll be focusing on more on the regulation of the psychopathology of trauma, giving you some tips to manage your trauma and breathing. Let's dive into part one. What is trauma? Trauma is derived from a Greek word for wound. According to Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, trauma is an emotional or physical response to one or more physically harmful or life-threatening events or circumstances with lasting adverse effects on your mental and physical well-being. Another definition by American Psychology Association in the Dictionary of Psychology, defines trauma as any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other destructive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effects on a person's attitudes, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. Let's also see what ICD, that is the International Classification of Disease, define trauma as. It defines trauma as an exposure to an extremely threatening or horrific event or series of events. When we talk about events, those events include that makes you feel frightened, under threat, humiliated, rejected, abandoned, invalidated, unsafe, unsupported, trapped, ashamed, and powerless. The ways trauma can happen include as an one-off event or an ongoing accumulative events, being directly harmed, witnessing an harm to someone else, living in a traumatic atmosphere, or being affected by trauma in family or communities. So trauma is not that story of something that happened back then. It's the current imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside people who experience them. Common example would be a racial trauma, more popular in people of color living in UK. Which organ in our body stores and processes trauma? Human brain is the organ. All this experience of trauma memories are formed and stored. Brain is a unique structure taking up to only 2% of our body mass but consumes 25% of oxygen, and it has a capacity to generate 23 watts of power, which is sufficient to light up a bulb. Brain stores traumatic memories different to regular ones. These memories are so overwhelming that brain doesn't process it first time around. An analogy would be like you have a choice to arrange fruits, veggies, and canned foods in your refrigerator in an organized way, or just by shoveling them into a refrigerator if you're in a hurry. The latter is how the brain might handle the traumatic information, which can lead to a telltale symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks, nightmares, isolation, dissociation, emotional detachment, heightened anxiety, and avoidance of trauma reminders, and more prominent symptoms of PTSD among other symptoms. Now, we can actually look into our brain structure in this picture. I would like to focus on the three main areas where our brain is more effectively functioning to execute our daily functions, become aware of our emotions, and also assess the areas of danger. So, brain functions, mostly the higher function, executive function, are in the prefrontal cortex, and emotional function is in the limbic brain, as you can see in the picture. And the primitive brain, that is a brainstem, is more focused in the basic survival needs. When you talk about the prefrontal cortex, as I've listed in the picture, it has nine functions: empathy, insight, response flexibility, emotion regulation, body regulation, intuition, attuned communication, and fear modulation. And when you look into the limbic brain over there, it is more responsible for the fight, flight, freeze response. If you remember in my previous videos, the connection between the lung and the mind and the anxiety, my link should be up in here. So check out that link. So I would have explained the main structures: the amygdala, the emotion center, and the hippocampus, the storage or memory house of our brain, is responsible for this fight, flight, and freeze stress response. What it does is things whether am I safe? Do people want me? Okay, and with that basis, assesses the danger around and reacts to the situation. And our primitive brain, as I already mentioned, is looking into whether do I have the basic survival needs. Let me now talk about the big T's versus little t's. It's common to minimize our experience. It wasn't that bad. Or it could have been worse. Minimizing our experience is an open invitation for avoidance. Avoidance is a risk factor for post traumatic symptoms, not an antidote. Having permission to categorize a traumatic experience into big T and little t allows us to appropriately label our experience. In therapy world, the big trauma is big T and small traumas are labeled little t. Big trauma is an acute event that profoundly compromises a person's safety and well-being. Exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injuries, or sexual violence, or witnessing the events as it occurred to others can be categorized as big T. And little trauma is something that is distressing events that can occur over a time or a combination with each of those little events. One small T is unlikely to lead into a significant distress. Multiple compound small t's, particularly in a short span of time, more likely to increase the distress and trouble with emotional functioning and well-being. The accumulative events, the big or small, can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder or a complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's now look into the big T's of the big traumas. What are those? As it listed here: natural disaster, war or terrorist attack, emotional neglect or abuse, sexual or physical assault, death of a loved one, domestic violence, accident, major surgery, or life-threatening illness. Now, let's look into what are the small t's, that is small traumas. Like as you can see in the slide, moving places, moving countries, financial worries, interpersonal conflict, bullying and harassment, adoption, miscarriage, giving birth, divorce or infertility, chronic mental or physical illness. Now, let me talk about how our body reacts to trauma stresses. If you remember in my previous video on anxiety attack, the connection between lung and mind, I would have spoken about the connection between the autonomous nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, on our lung function and emotions, and how the responses are triggered and how our body reacts to fight, flight, and freeze response. So just a quick reminder. Now, I just dwelled in depth of trauma learning and I found a very exuberant explanation of trauma and its comparison to the memory cells of immune system in the Trauma Recovery Institute. In that article, they have stated that trauma is similar to the memory cells in the immune system. The brain and the nervous system become sensitized to subsequent stressful or perceived stressful events experienced via neuroception. as a threatening or even a life-threatening, mirroring an original experience or experience once faced in the early childhood. We all know the memory T and B lymphocytes play a major role in the immunological function in our body. So they protect us against the microbial pathogens. So the immunological memory occurs after the primary immune response against antigen. So immunological memory is created when an individual is exposed to an initial exposure to a potential dangerous agent. The cause of the secondary immune response is similar to the primary immune response. After the B cells recognizes the antigen, it presents a peptide called MHC1 complex to a nearby affected T cells, and that leads to the activation of these cells and rapid proliferation of the cell. After the primary immune response has disappeared, the effector cells of the immune response are eliminated. However, there remains antibodies previously created in the body that presents a humoral component of the immunological memory and comprise an important defensive mechanism in the subsequent infection. In addition to the formed antibodies in the body, that there remains a small amount of these memory T and B cells that makes up the cellular component of the immunological memory. And they stay in the blood circulation in the resting state. And at the subsequent encounter with a similar antigen, then these cells become active and immediately attack the antigen and eliminate it. The memory cells have a long life, and it is actually recorded as it lasts up to several days in the decades in the body. When there has been a chronic inflammation, chronic infection, or a chronic stress or anxiety induced burden on this immune response, these memory cells become overactive and start to attack the friendly cells and the organs, confusing them for the threats. And this is called autoimmunity and presents in syndromes like inflammatory bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, colitis, etc. The trauma impacted on the brain and the nervous system acts in a very similar way to the immune system memory cells, responding to the subsequent threat or perception of the threat, which happens below the conscious awareness through a process called neuroception. In traumatology, this is called sensitized. After a trauma event or any other dangerous event a person perceives and becomes more sensitized to, then they actually become more, when they're exposed to a similar event, more sensitized or hypovigilant. The hypoarousal activity begins inside the person, and you're overly sensitized to look, sound, smell, or feeling that present the cues to their original stressful event. The person then acts in a way which may not promote pro-social reciprocity and may appear defensive, mistrusting, angry, even aggressive or withdrawn. All these are the defenses used to protect themselves from the repeat of the original trauma, while co-creating a variation of the original trauma that is called as reenactment. The road to a healthy, secure relationship is usually extremely difficult for people who have experienced the neglect and trauma precisely because the defenses they use to avoid the painful past often wind up provoking its recreation in the present setting. And this perpetuates a cycle of toxic stress, inflammation, and adversity. Now, let me actually talk about the physical impact of trauma. And this is a very holistic view of what is happening to our body in all our systems when we are exposed to trauma, either a big trauma or a small trauma. So when you're exposed to trauma, what happens to our brain architecture is there is a shrinkage in the prefrontal cortex, corpus callosum, and hippocampus, and they become enlarged and more reactive amygdala is present. So hence the reaction of fight, flight, and freeze more often when you sense or feel or smell a situation which was traumatic in the previous experience. And it also affects the neural pathways. The neural pathways need to rewire our brain from the old thought patterns and habits of the mind, conscious and unconscious. And it also affects the hormones. There is a prolonged high cortisol and adrenaline, creates a greater reactivity to stress, a long-term damage to the cells, structures of the body, and other hormone glands like thyroid function. And it also actually affects the toxin elimination function of our body. It impacts the intestine and the kidney, and they are less able to eliminate the toxins, and hence a slow gut or the unbalanced flora. This explains the IBS or IBD or colitis in people who have anxiety disorders. And it also affects the nervous system. Okay, so when you're exposed to the stressful event or a traumatic incident, your sympathetic system becomes supercharged and the parasympathetic system becomes inactive. So there is an imbalance in the nervous system. And it also affects the immune system. The resistance to the cortisol, to the lower cortisol, creates an unchecked inflammation. So there's a constant trigger of inflammation in the body. And this might be the cause of many diseases like asthma, arthritis, etc. And it also affects the brain waves. So the predominance of the wrong brain waves in a wrong part of the brain leads to anxiety, unable to concentrate, and increased risk of seizures. And it also affects the neurotransmitters. So the happy hormone, the dopamine, is less or becoming inactive. Hence, it reduces our motivation and focus and creates fatigue. And low serotonin causes depression. And at cellular level, again, it shortens telomeres, which prematurely ages and reduces the reproduction of the cells, and it can cause cancer. So these are a wider capture of damages caused by trauma to our physical body. Now, let me talk about the how our lungs are going to be responding to the stress response or the trauma created stress response. As you can see in the picture, I'm going to be, it looks like a bit complicated, but I'm not going to be making it very complicated. So just to give you an overview of how fascinating our network of fibers, the nervous system, is connected to the commanding center in our brain and commands a lung, and also is more directly linked to how we feel and act. So, as I already mentioned, brain consumes 25% of oxygen for its executive function. It also gets suffers this oxygen when we are in a stressful situation. Now, the basics of how our wiring internally happened, connecting our lungs to our executive function and the central nervous system, and also the peripheral nervous system. You can see in this picture here. So this is the brainstem area, the medulla and pons, as you can see in the picture, and it forms a part of the cerebellum, what we call in scientific term. And you can see this blue fiber dropping down, and this is called the vagus nerve. And this vagus nerve is the parasympathetic system, and it is actually innervated in the bronchioles. And the other nervous system, which is the sympathetic nervous system, as it appears the pink dots here, and from our cervical, that is our neck, and thoracic, that is our back, up to T11, which is actually up to our hip level over there and at the back. So the nervous system are coming from there and forming this sympathetic nervous system. And this is actually innervated in the bronchioles, and this is responsible for bronchodilation. And the other part you also need to be focusing on breathing. The main breathing muscle that is responsible is the diaphragm, as you can see, like an umbrella shaped flap like structure here. And this is actually wired with a phrenic nerve, the green nerve. And this is actually having the centers from our cervical neck region from C3 to C5. And also, you can see the thoracic junction, T1 to T12, the back of our body, that is a thoracic region. And that nervous systems are innervating our intercostal muscles, that is our rib cage. So our lung actually needs to contract and relax, and this is a enclosed in a rib cage, and the rib cage is also responsible to creating that vacuum pressure. And this all happens in a fraction of a second. That is what it's fascinating. So imagine there is a trauma and stress response, a fight or flight reaction. So what happens is your sympathetic nervous system is activated, preparing the peripheral muscles to run. For the peripheral muscles to run, it needs to have the oxygen. So it bronchodilation happens. And as you can see, the bronchodilation word here, sorry. So this actually activates the lungs to open up, airways to open up, more air enters, presumably more amount of oxygen. But what is happening here? More oxygen is entering, but already formed the metabolic product, the carbon dioxide, is just staying inside the lungs, and it is creating like a toxic gas. And your brain senses that, and it wanted to expel the carbon dioxide out, so it triggers the activation of faster breathing, and you panting happens, and you are trying to expel the carbon dioxide out. Okay, and excessive excretion of the carbon dioxide again creates an imbalance in your acidic status in your body, and there is a mismatch of sympathetic and parasympathetic, and you get this anxiety attack, which you perceive as shortness of breath and very breathless. What is really happening is you're expelling a lot of carbon dioxide. Some amount of carbon dioxide is also needed for our oxygen levels to be maintained in a balance. So this cannot happen until you trigger that parasympathetic action. Why? Because the vagus nerve here is the parasympathetic nervous system causes bronchoconstriction, allowing that to happen. So there is a mismatch until you cannot create a balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic action. You cannot come out of this anxiety attack or the traumatic, stressful event, which is creating that shortness of breath in your body response. But internally, your lung and your brain is struggling. There is a fight between your lung and your brain, if you could understand that. So, with that being said, that I would be explaining the tips and strategies of how to regulate, how to come out of this trapped situation of this parasympathetic, frozen state of parasympathetic, and activate it and regulate the function. And I'll be giving you some tips that focuses on your outer world, and tips that you can focus on your inner world inside your body as well. I hope this video was helpful. If you found this video helpful, please click that like and subscribe button and share with your friends and network. This means a lot to me. I'm Devi Sundar. I'll see you in the next video, part 2 of trauma and breathing.